Hi, Misha here, and you can tell we're back in town because of all the noise. What can you do? But while we were at the cabin, a friend of mine brought out not this 56S-2, or rather just AKS. No, this one's mine. You've seen it, picked it up about 4 years ago. But rather one he inherited from his brother. Mine is a Norinco branded, and his is a Polytech. So there are differences. And even though we've done a video on the 56S-2, it's been a little while. And I feel like I can do better going into more detail. Plus, you guys always ask me to cover Chinese AKs. Obviously, no new ones to talk about since they've been sanctioned since April of 1994, and before that they were banned along with other quote-unquote assault weapons or rifles in March of 1989, so we kind of have what we have, but this is one of the most popular, unique, and one I kind of looked for a number of years and kind of got lucky on because I usually wanted a shooter grade. So with that, let's let my buddy put a few rounds through his, since it's been kind of collecting dust for a couple of years. And then we'll just, dive into the history, why this came to be from the military's perspective, talk about the various configurations and importers in the pre-ban era.
Shooting my brother's AK.
Here's honestly a very common military pouch with the, and then it holds 5 standard so-called smooth back mags, very unique to China, and there are several variations, but I know what you really want to see. The iconic Chinese chest rig. I kind of feel like Fox here. We'll look at magazine variants in a minute, but let's talk about why such a distinctive gun came to be. I don't have mine out shooting much because, well, these have entered the realm of collectability, and to be honest, they're not the most fun shooting. However, when I did get it new, I wanted to make sure it worked, so we'll insert some clips from that range trip a few years ago. Honestly, it didn't begin with the Type 56 AK or SMG or assault rifle, but rather the Type 56 carbine, their variant of the Simonov SKS-45. Specifically, the jungle version here, as we call them. That wasn't really their name, but it works. It has the curly cues instead of the leather, and it has the fiberglass shoulder stock, complete with storage compartment. These were pretty iconic for China. We see them throughout the 60s, and a lot of them were meant for export because they don't have a ton of markings, and a lot of these stocks were just sold in America too. And you'll see some SKSs with a wood stock and then a Bakelite upper, even some with that so-called French tickler. But this kind of shows their early use of fiberglass. Wasn't exactly Bakelite, the Russian stuff we call that is actually an AG4S material. This is a little bit different, all from wood to kind of all-weather material. Of course, the SKS and AK were adopted at the same time in China. For that matter, they adopted the RPG. And of course, the original AKs were milled, but they very quickly start innovating their own thing. For example, while the earliest Chinese AKs have the open front sight hood, Around 1960, they went to a closed side hood, not dissimilar to the SKS, because it's frankly kind of cool. And then a few years later, about the time they were putting spike bayonets on their SKSs, then they decided, let's try putting some on our AKs. And then late 60s into the early 70s, depending on exactly which Chinese factory they came from, they switched from the milled receiver to the stamped. And I should mention, while the original guns were made at factory 66 or 616, they would soon spread out to like 386, 416, 56. Several factories made AKs, not to mention SKSs, and we do see this in that there are small differences in how they made the guns. Like, for example, the finish on the bolt carrier, the style of safety. We'll get there.
Here we go.
Returning to the Kalashnikov, they went to a unique stamped receiver. Famously, as you know, 1.5 millimeter. Was this done for strength? Sure. But it was also done so that internal components, like the bolt group, trigger group, could interchange with the original milled gun. Basically, if you keep similar dimensions to the milled, you end up with this kind of size receiver, including taking the same basic top covers. Because remember, China did not have the TDP, we'll call it, for the AKM. By that point, relations with Russia had broken down. So they made their own. This is why Chinese Type 56s, even when they go to the stamped receiver, still have a lot of early features like the ported gas tube, the slightly heavier barrel with the sling retention on the gas block as opposed to handguard retainer. But they wanted to modernize to save on weight and also to speed up production, because they were really exporting AKs in select fire form to military allies. Vietnam comes to mind, Pakistan. Eventually they would actually supply AKs either directly or indirectly to both Iran and Iraq for their wars. And so they were always kind of looking for ways to do it. Faster, better. And of course they're still supplying for the PLA at this point. Let's get out a mag here. Pretty much your standard slick back, slide back, smooth back mag. There are lots of variations. This is a Type 56-3 technically, because of the fixed stock. At least it would be in military parlance. And it's actually a Clayco imported, marked AKS. These were the first ones commercially available in America.
Shoots good.
Yeah, I've noticed those Chinese, they do heat up quick too. It's not hot out today. In the early 70s, they sought to further streamline, modernize the Type 56 in China, and the development was going ahead, but then there was tremendous social unrest, political upheaval. It's a pretty rough time, so this program is pretty much ground to a halt for several years, and this happens in lots of industry in China, not just small arms. But finally, in the late 70s, they're back on track with what was supposed to be the PLA's next generation, again known as the Dash 2 for the folder and the Dash 3 for the fixed stock. For what it's worth, the Dash 1 was a wood four-armed underfolder. A new type of quote-unquote Bakelite or fiberglass buttstock, complete with storage compartment. Again, this is why I brought out the SKS there. This kind of just really reminds me of it a lot. Interestingly, they didn't go to palm swell handguards. They kept the slick side with vents. Still that same heavy barrel. But they did go to the AKM style bayonet lug here versus the original Type 1. Here is the bayonet that actually came with this Clayco. Notice it does not have the wire cutter. I've read that that was just for export. It also does not have the saw teeth. So it's kind of a unique bayonet. Put that on there. It mounts very similar to an AKM. So that's one of the updates they did. Still making the steel mags. For what it's worth, I actually got this gun a couple of years ago from the same friend you've been seeing in the video so far. However, by the time these were ready to go, China had moved on, ultimately deciding on what we know today is the Type 81. But waste not, want not. To replace the 56-1 with the underfolding stock, they introduced the -2 here with the side folding stock. This is not really long after Russia themselves introduces their new side folder with the AKS 74 and all that. Although it's a totally different pattern, different hinge mechanism. It's pretty cool though. It lets the gun be quite compact, under 26 inches, folded in, depending on exactly which muzzle device you have on. And when deployed, you just pull it out. It's about 35, not quite 36 inches, again, depending on the muzzle device. Steel construction. And they did kind of streamline the magazines too. Here's another kind of interesting so-called all stamped variant. Notice the top is considerably different, even the ribbing down here, and it's lighter in the hands, but you know, it works. Another distinctive feature is of course the hidden compartment here. Obviously the pellet style cleaning kit from the fixed stock cannot fit here. And the underfolder never had a cleaning kit built in. You just had to carry it in your pouch. And essentially, you just needed a bullet tip or something similar. Get in here and pop it out. It has a little spring to keep it in there. And there's your kit. It's actually one of the bigger innovations of the update. Stamped piece here, spring-loaded. Pretty self-explanatory, I know, but it's a neat feature. And it just retains in there. Let's put a pin talking about the pistol grip for just a minute. The receiver is the same as we've had with the stamped. Same with the forearm. And this one actually has the Type 1 bayonet lug. Again, let's put a pin in that for just a minute. It is a very sturdy stock. Doesn't add a whole lot of weight to it. But of course, how does it shoot? Definitely not the most comfy butt plate, between being a little short and skinny, but I think it's because it's a slick blued metal. It always wants to slip around on my shoulder. There's no grip at all. My Norinco, his Polytech, both reliable, but both have some recoil to them. I think people think that overgassing is just a modern AK problem. truth is, a lot of your Chinese pre-bands can thump you too, especially when they kind of lose some weight like this, because it is a little lighter than some of the early ones like the Milds. But I think it's just interesting for its distinctive look. On the other hand, as I said earlier, by the time these were finally ready, the Dash 2 and Dash 3, the military wasn't all that interested. So mostly China turned to the export market, although within the country, police agencies, militia agencies, border guards, and some special forces in the interim did purchase these. But for the most part, it became a much bigger export success. Sri Lanka got some in the mid-'80s, and interestingly, Finland picked up around 100,000, along with some former East German MPI guns. They called these in Finland the RK56TP for, the side-folding stock. And while they never put them in frontline use, they were pretty much just kept in reserve for a what-if scenario. Can't imagine what Finland was worried about. And maybe for training and reserve duty, just in case. But they did get some. And so you do see the 56-2, and for that matter 3, pop up in the Middle East and Africa. These actually became quite popular because they were able to actually make, especially the fixed stalker, at a cheaper price point. And, well, foreign customers probably preferred the synthetic furniture, the Bakelite, we'll just call it from now on, over the traditional wood because they're not buying for looks. Interestingly, China kept on using bluing instead of going to the paint over phosphate finish, and the carriers could either be in the white or blued, really just depending on which factory they're coming out of. But one fortuitous thing, right as these were ready to go, right as the PLA said, nah, we don't need them, well, the US market was opening up. These were the first ones to come into the USA. For a while, it was thought that maybe Golden State Distributors brought some in. It was close, but looking at corporate records, Clayco seems to have just beat them. The company was opened up in late 1982, and brought over the first samples to show off at trade shows and get ATF approval in 1983. And they were advertising their wares by late summer of 1984. So they were on the market by 84, give or take. And this was the version they brought over. Fixed stock, 7.62 by 39, marked AKS, and either with the red-brown Bakelite or the black-green Bakelite. And again, I know it's more fiberglass. With this kind of straight-ish or squared-off style pistol grip, this stock with the storage compartment, steel butt plate, it's still a, Warsaw length. And with the AKM type lug for this style of bayonet with this very unique hanger, as far as I know. And here's the thing, they didn't sell very well. It seems like after the initial just few they brought over, that they brought over one large batch of AKSs, and they more or less sold that off through 85, 86. Guys, by 1987, Clayco was filing for bankruptcy. They were out of business. These guns did not do all that well. While export customers for military users didn't mind or even like this type of furniture, it was kind of quickly unveiled that American customers wanted wood. So late Claycos can sometimes be spotted with wood, but of course it's impossible to know, did it leave China or leave Clayco with the wood, either one, or did that get put on later because it's just, standard Type 56 furniture. Either way, and we don't know exactly how many of these came into America either, it was a relatively small number compared to what would come soon after. But they don't get quite the cachet that others do, and that's a shame. I think being the first is pretty neat, and I like the Bakelite furniture look.
Clear.
Been an object of desire for a lot of people for its unique place in history and relatively small import numbers. Now, I've seen some that seem ridiculously low. I think these were brought in the thousands, not hundreds, but I can't prove that. And there are several importers, and almost each importer had their own variation. But first, you know, this mag, even though it's actually the style they shipped with, steel, it's not quite right. After I got this gun, Chris Bartacci actually sent me this magazine, which ironically is not technically correct, but you know, rule of cool. It's just right in this gun, even if it maybe technically isn't. These are marked for factory 66, and they intentionally made them look Bakelite, AG4, Russian style. They're actually a plastic, a polymer. Kind of like how later on Tapco would do faux Bakelite mags. Well, China saw kind of the interest, you know, the Afghan war, people saw these mags, this color on the news, and so they more or less just made these for the US market, although I'm sure they exported some too. But so let's talk importers. Mine is an early one. It is B West. They started around 85, at least their guns are usually dated 85. You know, hitting the market then, or 86, it takes a little time. And they would seem to be the first company to bring over this style, 56S-2. Although they weren't marked that. Again, they were just marked AKS early on. And these would be Norinco brand name. But the early ones would still have that Type 1 lug here for this style of bayonet. This is not the one that goes with the gun. This is actually an East German. But it's essentially the same type as a milled AK. I'm not going to force this on it. It fits okay on this gun, but I don't want to mar things up, but it'll give you the idea. It kind of, because of the Chinese spec gas block, is a little narrow there. Again, I could force it, but that just gets into specs. And this was the style that they did, including this unique, sometimes called a 1919. I also think of it as a VZ58 grip. And you tend to only see these on Norincos. My friends Polytech, you've been looking at in the video. Actually, I think they did lock on. Yeah, never mind, it did lock on. Has the more squared off grip, like the Clayco you saw. And if you could see in the clips with him, there are some differences, because King's Firearms, KFS, also started importing the 56S-2 amongst many others. And these would be the Polytech brand name. In fact, during this pre-ban era, only KFS imported the Polytechs. They typically had the muzzle nut, the Type 1 lug, and they had an enlarged safety selector, and sometimes an enlarged mag catch. And they also tended to have a higher polished blued finish, which looked really attractive, but seemed to attract fingerprints and other things very readily. And at least for someone like me who lives in a humid environment, it tended to rust a little easier. Now, I'm going to be honest, the Chinese bluing tends to rust kind of anyway. It's the only AKs I kind of have problems with, or I've bought. I've seen some completely rusted out that have been in garages, whereas, you know, other AKs not so much. But the Norinco matte, more matte bluing, I should say, it's still pretty slick. It seems to be a little less showy of such things. I know that the Polytech guns are supposed to be kind of higher grade, higher quality. I get it, and if that's your bag, sure. But one reason it took me a long time to get a 56S-2 is because I wanted a Norinco because they seemed a little closer to the military export type guns. Another interesting thing that China did that's in this chest pouch, they had your standard AK magazine, but they made a loading tool for it, which is currently stuck on this thing here. And you know it's China because it's got a big old star. It just fits over, and then it actually just uses standard Type 56 SKS 10 round stripper clips. I believe these are just standard SKS. Yeah, they are also used. I never have been terribly good at these kind of things. And to be fair, this is a bit of a hodgepodge together solution. If you look at the Russian AK-74s, they actually have clip guides and a special tool intended for that, for the 5.45 guns, and they work a lot smoother. So back to this guy. We talked about how we had B-West importing this one here, and then KFS imported the Polytech version. Little differences there, including the pistol grip. That's probably one of the most identifiable ones right off the bat. But then you had a couple other companies pick up importation. IAC or IA began around 86, 87, and while some early ones would just be Mark 56 or 56S, they would be the first, as far as I know, to be Mark 56S-2. They would also be the ones with the AKM Type 2, if you prefer, bayonet lug. Still Norinco brand. Again, Polytech, only KFS. And then around 1988, you had one more importer, CSI. They also brought over the guns, Mark 56S-2. And while some were Bakelite, at least the last run they did were an interesting hybrid of this stock with a wood pistol grip and wood handguard, but they're still marked -2. As far as I know, and there's probably a couple of small batch importers I'm not aware of, those are the 4 pre-ban importers. And obviously after March of 1989, a gun like this would not be importable. It had way too many features. I mean, when your main distinguishing feature is your side folding stock, and those are prohibited, yeah, what are you going to do? That's just kind of over. There are also a few kind of weird anomalies in collections, you know, 1 or 2 of this imported as samples. We're not talking about those. I'm just kind of talking about the standard guns. Now you might think since 3 companies imported Norincos and only 1 Polytechs, the Polytechs would be rarer. No one knows for sure, but it's been observed by myself and many others that you come across the Polytech guns with much more frequency than you do the Norinco guns. Everything we know points to that KFS imported more Bakelite side folders than the other 3 companies did together with Norinco side folders. Again, some suggest the numbers could be as low as 400 for Norinco and 600 for Polytech, so 1,000 total. Considering you do see these out in the wild with pretty good frequency, that seems a little low, but maybe it's true. Maybe they just survive at a good rate, because these were kind of weird even back in the day. And they didn't sell great compared to the Woodstock, fixed or underfolding, for kind of the same reason those Claycos didn't. They were weird, and back then people didn't really go for weird most of the time. They're cool looking, they're reliable, not bad on the accuracy department.
Not the most comfortable.
Not the most comfortable to shoot.
AR is much easier on me.
Even other AKs. There are other AKs that I think are just more comfy.
There you go.
How times have changed. But of course, post 89, people became more interested in the pre-ban Chinese, and then post 94, after they were sanctioned and even the Mac 90 could no longer come in, then interest started to slowly but surely go up. So with that, which version do you like the look of more? And when it comes to the fixed stalkers, would you prefer the black or the red Bakelite? I guess the real question is it more or less comfortable than an underfolder?
I'm gonna say more comfortable.
Yeah, I could see that because you don't have that.
The cheek weld on the
Well, that's true.
little bar is a little bit awkward
That is definitely
on the
true.
underfolder.
I will say that when it comes to comfort, the folder here, as we discussed, is probably better than the underfolder. They did a better job, especially a cheek weld, and it's a very sturdy stock. But this small and slippery butt plate isn't doing any favors. These kind of token ridges aren't all there. So, while that is the collectible version, no doubt about her, if you're just wanting a shooter, this one is going to be more comfortable. Although, since this stock is lighter than wood, even it isn't going to be as comfortable as just your bog standard 56S. That's kind of the truth. If you're wanting a collectible gun, there's all kinds of unique Chinese variants. If you're wanting a shooter, really the most common standard gun in, if you know, fixed stock over underfolder, is probably the most comfortable. Of course, all are going to have chrome lined cold hammer forged barrels. They're all going to have either milled or 1.5 stamped receivers. They all take standard mags. And these were among the last in the development line in China of the 56 series, because obviously they're moving away. Although there would still be the Type 56C. There was that 11-inch version, kind of based on this, but made even more compact. We never did get those. We never had pistols from China back in the day. No one really thought about doing an AK pistol. It's a cool design, but if I only could have one Chinese, it would still be the good old classic fixed woodstock underfolding spiker. But no, since my friend had his out shooting it, I figured might as well do a video since I know there's interest and demand. Again, sorry for the noise in town. You know, nothing I can do about it. Just how it goes. But I appreciate you hanging out today. I'd love to hear your Chinese AK experiences because, you know, just as soon as you think you know everything, there's a gun that comes out that completely shatters expectations and breaks the rules. Because there are some just odd imports and odd deviations that happened in these back in the day. As always, if you could, please like, share, subscribe. Really do like the video, please, because that helps a lot. Commenting helps a lot. And if you really like to go the extra distance, you can either do like super thanks, or you can go over and look at Patreon. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.